Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, with the election fewer than 6 months away and Biden facing a disastrous poll showing him losing in 5 out of 6 swing states, we are entering the Democratic Party's favorite season. That's right, it's left punching season. The time of year where all of the Democratic Party's failures are heaped on liberals' most beloved scapegoat, progressives. Hillary Clinton officially launched left punching season in a viral MSNBC appearance last week, in which she castigated young people for not knowing enough about the history of the Middle East to understand why they should support Israel's murder of 14,000 children in an indiscriminate bombing campaign, the killing and torturing of doctors and humanitarian aid workers, and the collective punishment of 2.3 million people by denying them food and medical aid.
I have had many conversations, as you have had, with a lot of young people over the last many months now. And you're right, they don't know very much at all about the history of the Middle East, or frankly about history in many areas of the world, including in our own country.
Meanwhile, over the weekend, perennial left puncher Jonathan Chait penned a column for New York Magazine titled "In Defense of Punching Left: The Problem with Solidarity." In it, he takes on a new book by leftist Astra Taylor and Leah Hunt Hendricks called Solidarity, in which they argue that too often liberals seek to legitimize their positions by punching left, distancing themselves from social movements to make themselves appear reasonable by comparison, which only strengthens the hands of conservatives and pulls the political center to the right. I detect no lies there. But that didn't stop Chait from writing a lengthy column that unwittingly corroborates Taylor and Hunt Hendricks' argument that left punching is empty virtue signaling, insofar as Chait's argument failed to articulate a single rational basis for punching left. Now, of course, it's true that no movement or political orientation is above criticism, but the left's complaint isn't merely about being critiqued. Our complaint is that left punching by liberals is a performative strategy used to deflect blame for the Democratic Party's own failures onto a largely powerless but increasingly popular populist left. Liberal criticism of the left is rarely substantive or principled. In fact, left punching liberals often defensively insist that they agree with the left on 99% of things, even as they disparage us. They insist we share the same ideals, that they are, in fact, progressives too. Indeed, in his piece, Chait balks at Taylor and Hunt Hendricks' suggestion that Democrats are torn between doing right by their constituents and appeasing their corporate wing. As Chait puts it, quote, "It would surprise any liberal to learn we have no desire to redistribute wealth, tackle climate change, or advance social justice, and only care about corporations and the status quo." Well, the difference between liberals and the left, Chait argues, is that unlike the left, liberals are simply more pragmatic. They understand the real stakes here. In this case, the election of 2024. And coincidentally, I would point out the 2020 election, the 2016 election, and every election of my lifetime is the most important one. They say there's an existential threat to democracy, abortion rights, civil rights, voting rights, kids in cages, etc., etc., etc. And because of this, progressives, they say, must hold their nose and vote blue no matter who, no matter what Democrats do. And Democrats must ignore their faithful left in favor of making offerings to right-leaning voters who might be brought within the fold. Biden should build the border wall so that Trump won't, or so the logic goes. The core rationale that undergirds Chait's argument and the argument of so many liberals who see themselves as the adults in the room is that to win, you have to make yourself appealing to the centrist middle. There's just one problem. The cohort that's abandoning Biden the fastest, despite his nonstop pandering to the middle, are moderate and conservative-leaning voters, not the left. As the New York Times reported on Monday, Trump wins just 2% of Mr. Biden's very liberal 2020 voters who think the system needs at least major changes, compared with 16% of those who are moderate or conservative. The weakness of a centrist electoral strategy should come as no surprise at this point. One of the key insights to come out after Trump's 2016 win was that very few voters identified themselves with the mix of socially liberal, economically conservative views that liberal, or should I say neoliberal, Democrats pander to with their mix of identity politics and austerity measures. Remember in 2016 when Chuck Schumer argued that, quote, "For every blue-collar Democrat we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we will pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburban Philadelphia area"? Well, we all know how that worked out. As you can see from this chart of 2016 electorate, it is the top left quadrant, economically progressive and socially conservative, that presents the most opportunities for a candidate willing to engage in genuine economic populism, not the bottom right quadrant, which represents economic conservatism and social liberalism. The top left is the quadrant that made Bernie Sanders an out-of-nowhere contender in 2016 and which ultimately won the presidency for Donald Trump. But as clear as it is that centrists misunderstand the body politic, in his piece, Chait argues that it is in fact the left who get it wrong. He argues that he's right to criticize aspects of left-wing thought that he finds to be excessive, and that liberals are simply attempting to be reasonable. But what's reasonable? A poll from last September showed that 2/3 of Democrat-leaning voters didn't want Biden as a presidential candidate in 2024 at all. Was the Democratic Party being reasonable in shutting down the primary process and preventing the voters from vetting an alternative choice? What sort of political offerings should be considered excessive? Even years after the Bernie movement died and Bernie, the country's biggest cheerleader for universal health care, sidelined his own fight in service of supporting Joe Biden, a strong majority of Americans still say the government should ensure health coverage for all Americans. Meanwhile, Joe Biden made it clear that even if by some miracle Medicare for All passed the House and Senate, he'd veto it. That certainly sounds excessive to me. Is promising to veto Medicare for All a choice driven by reasonability? Or might it have something to do with the fact that Biden has taken more money from the healthcare and pharmaceutical industries than any other politician in America? Same question about a wealth tax, which 69% of registered voters in 7 swing states support. Is it pragmatic to ignore the popularity of this policy in the very swing states where Biden is performing abysmally? Or is it a naked bid to maintain his faithful base of billionaire backers? Note that Biden had more billionaire backers than any other candidate in 2020, and 94 billionaires have already donated to his campaign this year. Seems to me that when Taylor and Hunt Hendricks accused Democrats of being overly accommodating to their corporate wing, they may have had a point. Now, I could go on and on listing popular policies that Joe Biden has openly rejected or more subtly sabotaged, like the $15 minimum wage, which his henchman Chuck Schumer stripped out of the must-pass COVID relief package in 2021, even though a $15 minimum wage was so popular that Florida voters passed it on the same ballot on which they nominated Donald Trump in 2020. But the point is this: Chait fundamentally misunderstands the left's relationship to the center. Our efforts to push populist policies aren't designed to hurt Democrats. Adopting them will quite literally help them succeed. Populist policies are popular. It's right there in the name. But Chait insists on framing the left as navel-gazing and self-indulgent, uninterested in persuasion, arguing oddly that the left only cares about contests of willpower and dismisses protest as a tool for just extraordinary occasions, rather than an obvious tool for shifting public opinion. It's like he's never heard of the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, or the anti-Vietnam War protests. Leftists quite obviously do believe in persuasion, which is why we're willing to take on hard fights that don't favor us in polling, like defunding the police. And while we're willing to fight for Medicare for all and, things like racial equality years before polls validated those efforts. But Chait is missing that persuasion is not needed if you've already won the opinion battle. And the most significant left criticism of the liberals isn't that they aren't willing to take on the more fringe positions of the left, but that they reject the popular ones. Chait argues that liberals reject populist economic policies favored by the left because, quote, liberals take very seriously notions of individual rights and universally applicable principles, while leftists tend to criticize political liberalism as a recipe for maintaining inequalities of power between the privileged and the oppressed. Okay, well, if that's longhand for leftists think working people should keep more of their paychecks because the principle of you should be able to afford rent and food if you work 40 hours a week in the richest country in the history of the world is more important than a vague respect for the invisible hand of the market, then yes, guilty as charged. The more you read, the more it becomes clear that the basis of Chait's complaint is simply that he doesn't share working class values. In fact, it sounds like he might just be another neoliberal hell-bent on preserving an economically unequal status quo because it's a status quo in which he thrives. Chait fully exposes himself when he brings up Israel's war in Gaza as an example of an issue where leftists are extreme. He refers to anti-Zionism as, quote, the left-wing cause du jour, and laments that some on the left are critical of Zionism as an ideology that requires the expulsion and subjugation of non-Jews to maintain the Jewish demographic majority necessary for a Jewish state. As Chait writes, quote, the stakes of staying on good terms with the left on Israel have quickly escalated from opposing the occupation to opposing Israel's existence in any form to increasingly refusing to condemn the murder of Israeli civilians. Of course, this is a straw man. Chait intentionally frames the pro-Palestinian movement as extreme to avoid engaging with the fact that Biden's position of providing unconditional diplomatic, financial, and military aid to Israel as it reportedly tortures people in camps and uses drones to target children and aid workers is the most extreme and most out of touch position of all. A recent poll shows that 70% of voters now support a permanent ceasefire and de-escalation of violence in Gaza, including 83% of all Democrats and a majority of independents and Republicans. Yesterday, Biden told Congress he was moving ahead with more than $1 billion in new weapons deals for Israel, just days after the White House said it had paused a shipment of bombs to Israel due to concerns about the humanitarian impact of an assault on Rafah, where civilians have been told they could find safe shelter for months. All of this for Israel, whose ministers joined a far-right march just yesterday demanding resettlement of the Gaza Strip by Israel and the expulsion, aka ethnic cleansing, of Palestinians from the area. All this for Netanyahu, who has declared that he would invade Rafah even if a temporary ceasefire was reached. Tell me again, who has the extreme position? The populist left or the genocide-backing neoliberal center? Chait argues toward the end of his article, after chiding the anti-genocide left, that, quote, moral clarity and fervor can be useful at times, but they invoke fundamentally unrealistic ideas of how politics and governing can be conducted. But Biden is on the brink of losing an election, and it's not because he's been forced into unpopular positions by a radical fringe left, but because he's chosen to take his base for granted to instead chase moderate, status quo-loving voters during an election that pollsters say is a change election. Chait argues that when leftists chide liberals for criticizing the left in order to appear reasonable, they seem unable to imagine any of these liberals as actually attempting to be reasonable. But what he fails to grasp in the end is that he's fundamentally wrong about what is in fact reasonable, pragmatic, or popular. Punching left, turning your back on economic populism is what earned Democrats Donald Trump. And it looks very much like their insistence on being the adults in the room is going to put Donald Trump back in the White House again. If it happens, don't blame the left. We quite literally told you so.
It seems to me it comes down to just a fundamental tactical disagreement. I mean, I know Chait, I've been reading him for years. He thinks it is very important for Joe Biden to win the election instead of Donald Trump, and that he writes in defense of or in trying to persuade people to share that view. You have taken the position, you've said it many times in the show, that, well, while you might in a vacuum, or if a gun was put to your head, prefer if Biden was president over Trump, you are not going to you're not going to vote for him. You're going to vote for a candidate who much more perfectly aligns with your views, or very closely does, like Jill Stein, and that you think that's a valid choice, and he and you just totally disagree on that.
Yeah, well, the irony is, for all of his criticism of the left on persuasion, it doesn't seem like he's very interested in doing any persuading of the center. It seems to be a strategy of castigating the left, the people that the Democratic Party relies on to get out there, knock doors, donate money, post favorably on social media. The fact that Biden is losing the youth vote, the black vote, the Latino vote, all are not just losing those individual votes, but also losing the cultural forces that create excitement around an election. Trump just held a rally in Jersey with tens of thousands of people in attendance. Biden could probably struggle to fill this studio space that we're in right now if he tried to do the same thing in the same place. And so there is a choice that's being made that the left is just going to hang around and be there no matter what, while we chase these votes from people who have another option, a real conservative, a real Republican, if that's what they're interested in, instead of this Republican light that Democrats transform themselves into every election season. And we're seeing politically the results of this, that there's a ratchet effect that keeps pushing American politics right to the right. And it's because there's so much focus on attacking the far left in a way that you do not see the Republican Party taking aim at the far right in the same way. And the core point here is that if leftists were making this case that Biden had to embrace the totality and the most fringe aspects, the most unpopular aspects of the left agenda, then that would be a better case for Chait. But the problem is there's this huge field of policies that are enormously popular, including among these more moderate voters that he claims to want. But it's not these moderate suburban ladies in Philadelphia that he thinks are kind of fiscally conservative and socially liberal. No, it's quite the opposite. It's this ragtag group of people that went from Obama to Trump to, all over the place, because they're people who are working class, who are populist, and who like progressive economic policies, even if they're culturally all over the place.
In my bottom right quadrant, all by my lonesome self, if that's what it takes, and I invite anyone who wants the government to leave them alone to come and join us. But I agree with you that Biden's problem is, while alienating voters like yourself on the left, he's also alienating or not successfully making a pitch to voters in the center, very moderate suburban. He's clearly after the Nikki Haley voters. He keeps making emotional and rhetorical appeals to them. And they do exist, and he will get some of them, but is it enough to build a winning coalition? I worry not worry, I don't care. I theorize that building a winning coalition for Biden might actually just be impossible.
Yeah, and could Biden, remember he was vice president to Barack Obama. Why doesn't he have the insight to understand why so many Obama voters switched and voted for Donald Trump? It's not just getting Nikki Haley voters.
Successfully.
Well, no, I don't think that's what it is. I think that Obama, how he ruled, how he led the country, and how he ran are two different things. So I'm not giving him undue credit here. But he presented himself in his campaign as a change candidate, hope and change, and as a populist, an economic populist who was going to go after the banks, who was going to be a departure from the Democratic Party that was in the pocket of big Wall Street, right next to the Republican Party there. And that's why you got a lot of these voters who later saw that same vision in Donald Trump, who also didn't follow through on his promises, mind you, but saw that rhetorical vision and decided to pivot that way. And any candidate who chooses to fill that lane, I think, has a lot of opportunities before them.
We'll have more Rising right after this.